before we get started, two things. The TA is back in town, happily married, and so he's ready to set up and give you your problem set, which should be coming soon. Basically, that would be about, we'll have a problem set coming up on the belief state planning and farm duties. There is also this question of midterm, which I believe should be held in middle of the semester, which slowly is reducing its size. So I would not be, since problem sets are sort of mini take-home exams, right? I mean, so you're doing the problems at home. The midterm cannot have those kinds of problems because it's, assuming it's going to be a time test, I don't expect that you will have time to do too much during the time in class. So most likely the midterm would be more of a sanity test that in fact with no books and no internet, you still remember something about what we've been talking about. Okay, that's what I'm going to be testing, and so it's going to be complementary rather than competing with homeworks. It's not going to have the same kind of problems as the homework problems. I will try to give you some example problems of the kind I'll be looking for so that you'll have some sense to what to kind of look for. My assumption is if you sort of attended all the classes and understood the material at the first order of approximation, you shouldn't have trouble. And so I'm really trying to figure out if there are people who don't even understand anywhere near the first order of approximation. That's what the midterm is for. So we need to pick a date. I am willing to do it starting next Wednesday, which also happens to be Halloween, which is, instead of candy, I can give you exam. But if any of you have kids or want to be kids, and I can also do it the Monday after that. Okay, what?
I would prefer the Monday after that.
Monday after that. Is that fine with everybody? So Monday after. So remember, you said you did this. Later on, don't come to me and say it wasn't really middle of the semester. Okay. So Monday after next Wednesday. Okay, which would be in the November first week. Okay. And then remember that the PalmDP homework will be coming and you have to work on it in parallel. These are different things. We're not going to test you on exactly the things that you did homeworks and programming projects on. Any other questions? And this is coverage of the meeting. Until the class before that. So since it's Monday after, so it will be also CSP and whatever else I do next week. Okay, and then one of my students actually suggested to me that after that, basically, since we'll be, in the last 1/3 of the semester, or maybe even less, I might well do short quizzes. I mean, I don't know whether I will be able to actually manage it, but I might do short quizzes during this, for the rest of the semester, a couple of them. Okay, so I don't want to. So basically, the answer to your question is everything until next Wednesday would be included. Okay. But again, remember that I'm mostly looking for things that I probably said in the class. And actually, most of the time, I would be asking for things that I've already said in the class. Okay. And it would not be open book because of this. Okay. But I think it's fine. I mean, do people want full closed book or a sheet on which they write stuff? Okay. Anybody want? Okay, so I'm actually fine with me. It's fine with me because it will involve actual work on your part, and that will make me happy. You can bring one 8x11 sheet, with stuff that's written on it, and then you will submit it along with the exam. Okay. That'll also tell me what you consider important. And if not important enough stuff there, then I don't know what to do. But anyway, so I think you don't have to do it, but you're allowed to do it.
Will the paper readings be also included?
As I said, first order approximation, only the stuff that is discussed in the class. So the parts of the papers that were discussed in the class. Anything I discuss in the class is fair game. Okay? I know that I'm supposed to respond. I mean, a lot of people gave a lot of comments, and I have like pages and pages of it that I printed and I went through them. I think that what I'm going to do, this is regarding the survey, what I'm going to do is just put word comments on it and post the PDF. I mean, send it to you. Okay, so that might be the easiest thing. Generally, there's one question that people did have, and I'd like to answer that, which is exactly what are we supposed to learn by the end of this? Okay, what you're supposed to learn, in my view, is any topic that we covered here, you should be able to read the AAAI papers, ICHKAI papers, the papers in the AI conferences, and understand them. At least the first page you should be able to understand. That's what it is. Okay, it's a graduate level course, and basically you should be able to, I mean, if I could actually cover all the topics such that you can read any paper in AAAI, I would be much happier. I don't think I would be able to do that. But for the topics that I'm doing here, you should be able to read papers in the conferences and understand. That's what you should get out of. Okay. And I think there was also a question as to there's so many things that are discussed in the class. I'm not quite sure what is important, what's not important. But that's how life is. And so, I mean, I tend to tell myself this, that I subsidize my teaching with my research. Being in a state school, really my performance evaluations depend more on the research than on teaching. And so I get a lot of money so that I can teach fewer courses and I can do a reasonable job for the courses I teach. And if I can forward that argument, I subsidize my graduate teaching with my undergraduate teaching. Because undergraduate courses are well specified, people are happy with the homeworks and projects they have, at least the people who continue until the end of the course. Graduate courses, you have to be, essentially, I have to be able to tell myself that I taught you something that's still completely relevant, right at the edge of what's going on. And that typically does make some people quite unhappy. And so whatever goodwill I get in undergraduate courses, I pour it into the graduate courses and it disappears. So that's fine. But that's part of graduate courses, because in a sense, the right way to figure out these things is, start reading papers. And I'm just trying to get you there. That's basically okay. I will give more directed comments on people's comments. I'll post mine, send it to you. Any other questions? Okay, so we're going back to CSP, which we were discussing last class. And so we were comparing CSP versus satisfiability versus integer programming at the end of last class. So today we'll now come back to just CSP. And so this stuff is basically, you can quickly look at it. Essentially, all this is saying is, for a normal search tree, the A-star search idea where you start from a node and you reach some other node. So the right conceptual view is search in a graph of nodes, and then you're trying to find a path between two nodes. Okay, and there are lots and lots of different approaches for that kind of research. Depth first search, breadth first search, A-star search, IDA star search, and all this stuff. Okay, when you come to CSP, it is a special case of this search, but it is a specialized enough special case that most of the approaches some of the approaches that you use for graph search don't make any sense. In particular, for example, notice that a couple of things you see already, that unlike general A-star search where nodes don't have any structure, all you are actually thinking of is child generator function which generates children, and then a goal test function which checks whether you have reached the goal node. That's all you care about. For one thing, CSP is more structured because state is made up of state variables and their valuations. Okay, and then the children generation essentially is very structured too, because it just involves giving every variable a value. So you know exactly how many decisions you have to make. You have to make one decision for each of the children. Okay, each of the variables. Okay, what that means is the state space is finite because the total number of complete assignments if you have only n variables and it's a Boolean CSP problem, it's only 2 power n. Okay? Unlike A star search, generally doesn't have to have a finite state space. Okay? And you know, so that's one thing. And then a state is a goal state if all the variables are assigned and no constraints are violated. That's what we say. Okay? It also means, one more interesting thing is, if your current partial assignment already violates a constraint, there is no point in going forward on it. This is not something that is known in graph search algorithms normally, because if you go to a point, you don't quite know whether you should backtrack from it, because there is definitely no path from here all the way to the goal node. And the constraints kind of tell you that you already violated somebody's constraint, and as you go down the search tree, I mean, unless you remove assignments, which actually will happen in local search algorithms, we'll talk about that too. But normal systematic search algorithms start with null assignment and then keep giving assignments to more and more variables. And what that means is, once you violated a constraint, every node in the subtree below you would also be dead. And there is no point whatsoever in actually enumerating that tree. Right? So you want to go back, and that's an important difference. And then one very useful difference is all goals occur at the same depth. From a CSP point of view, all goals for CSP are complete assignments. Not every complete assignment is a solution, but every solution is a complete assignment, which means they'll all occur exactly at depth n, where n is the number of variables. Okay, what that means is, and then in the basic formulation, all goals have the same cost. That means all complete assignments that don't violate any constraints are considered equally good as solutions. Okay, and then given all this, it turns out you should not be thinking of breadth first search. You should not be thinking about iterative deepening A star search. You should not be thinking of most of the search algorithms that you looked at previously, in your intro to AI course. The only thing that makes sense is a depth first search, because you do know that all children are at the same depth, so there is no worry that you might get a child at a lower depth when there is one at a higher depth, a shallower depth. Such a thing cannot happen. All children are at the same depth. Okay, so really in CSP, all search is just depth first search. So that's a useful thing to know, to realize that graph search is a more general case of CSP search. And essentially, it's not that we gave up on this graph search idea. It's just that this is a very specialized case for which, you should not be wasting time doing breadth first search or iterative deepening search or any of these things. Okay? So what you do essentially, there are, I'll skip over this, you probably looked at them, but I'll just give you an example. So I have my little CSP problem here. The variables are x, y, z, and they can take values red, green, or blue. And then it's basically a graph coloring problem. That means no two adjacent variables can have the same value. Okay. So conceptually, what do? You start with an empty assignment. Okay, and then you choose a variable to assign the value to. Okay. And now here's the interesting thing. When you choose the variable to assign the value to, the question is that a backtrackable decision or not? That means, so right now in this tree, I'm saying I'm choosing to assign value to x first. Okay, and then if I choose x, then x can be given value r or g or b. Those are the search decisions. Okay, now this is also a search decision sort of. I chose to work on x first. Now, any of these decisions, the search decisions, I have to backtrack. What that means is, if I try going like this, and if I don't get a solution, I have to go all the way back and go with the next batch. My question is, do I also ever have to question whether my idea of doing X first, whether that should also be backtracked on? That you don't have to backtrack on. And I hope you understand that. That's another huge improvement in savings. Huge savings in search, right? Because intuitively everybody needs a value. So the order in which you give them values doesn't matter. Now, however, do you think that if you chose X and then Y and then Z, and your friend chose Z and then X and then Y, would you both do the same amount of search? That's not true. because in fact that's where the heuristics come actually for CSP, because you can almost see that certain variables are critical and you should give them values first. And based on their values, everybody else's values will kind of fall in place. Okay, I mean you can almost see that even at intuitively. In a minute we'll talk about the most constrained variable heuristic that you already looked at. Okay, so you don't ever have to backtrack on the goal order. You only have to backtrack on the values. You don't have to backtrack on the variable order. You only want to backtrack on the order, on the values that you are given a variable. Okay, so I chose x. In this branch I'm giving xr, in this branch xg, in this branch xp. I don't even actually generate them. This is depth first, so I only just generate the first branch. X is r. So now my partial assignment is x equal to r. Right? Then I chose y, and then I gave y equal to r. At this point, my partial assignment is x equal to r, y equal to r. And then this says that x and y cannot both be the same value. So there is a constraint violation at this point of time. Notice I haven't yet looked at z. In fact, there could be a much larger set of variables, and I didn't look at any of them. I'm already dead here, so there's no point in going forward. So I backtrack. Okay, backtrack essentially means, well, now when you do backtracking, the interesting thing, of course, is you have to go up the search tree and come down again. An important issue that we will talk today, hopefully, is exactly how to do the backtracking intelligently. If you don't have any, particularly good idea, the obvious idea is what's called the chronological backtracking. Just means just redo the last decision that you did. It turns out sometimes chronological backtracking is a dumb idea. And you really need to go up higher up the tree. And if you are able to go higher up the tree, you can improve search much more. Okay, and I'll give you an example in a minute, but in the background you can start thinking about examples of intelligent backtracking in your own life. But anyway, so here in this particular case, I'll just assume we're doing chronological backtracking. If I don't say anything else, it's just that. So then y equal to r, then I try the different value for y. I say y equal to g. Okay, now there's nothing wrong yet. X equal to r, y equal to g is fine. So then I go to z, and I give z r. That will fail. Then I go up, I give z g. That will fail. Then I'll go up and give z b. That will succeed. And I'm done. Okay, so that's basically the idea of tree, the search here. Okay, now the problem, of course, is while the search trees here are finite, they're still pretty large. Okay, if the variable with the largest domain has d values in its domain, and there are n variables, then the number of leaf nodes in this tree can be d power n. And since these are all combinatorial trees and everything is always at the leaf node, because for example, that in the binary trees, there are just as many nodes at the leaf node as in all the interior levels, right? And so essentially it's the order of d power n still. Okay, and that's the large number, and you don't really want to be solving you don't want to be looking at all of them. You want to reduce the number, yes?
When we search that tree, do we need to build all the branch or leaf in the beginning, or
no? You just basically, you can write it as a recursive function. These are depth first searches, so you can write it as a recursive function where essentially originally you have a null assignment. Okay, then you pick a variable, you give a value to it, and then now you have an assignment x equal to r, and then you call yourself x equal to r, give the values to the other guys.
But still, when you check the constraint in the left bottom one, if it is fails or not, you have to check with given that value for x and that given
No. So
y.
you should know the path that led you here. Yes. That you should know. And that is easy to get. Even in a recursive program, you can send your ancestors' information to your child. Okay? But you don't need to know all this stuff. I'm sorry. You don't need to know all this stuff when I'm here.
But still, you are saying you are tracking the path, but still you need to extract your label on the path.
Yeah, that's all. But that's still linear in the size. It's basically, it's linear in depth. Okay, and keeping information that's linear in the depth is considered very reasonable. Okay, but keeping information around that is exponential in the depth is not very good. Okay, and again, this is stuff from Intro to AI too. Depth first search, one of the advantages is that it only keeps information that's linear in the depth. Whereas depth first search will keep information around in the memory that is exponential in the depth. Okay, fine. So you understand this. This is a very simple point. Now we're going to just improve a whole bunch of things about it. Okay, one idea would be, how do you choose the variables? Which variables would you choose first? Okay, and the answer for that essentially is choose the variable that is most constrained. And that can be interpreted in different ways. Okay, one simple way of interpreting it is choose the variable that has the least number of values in its domain. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay, now sometimes there may be situations where the variables all have the same number of values in their domains, but as soon as you pick one of them and give a value, then a whole bunch of other variables become much smaller. That means their effective domain reduces. In which case you need to track the live domain. You need to track the live domain. Okay, that idea is actually called forward checking, but we'll get to that in a minute. But the simplest idea is just keep track of the number of values in the domain of each variable, and then statically pick the variable that has the least number of values first, and then the next and the next. Now, in this case, obviously, that's not going to be really helpful, right? Because all of them have 3 values. Okay, in some cases, it does help, because you may know up front itself that certain variables have much smaller number of values. Okay, now the other idea, the other idea that keeps track of live domains, I'll get to it in a minute. That's called forward checking, and I'll get to it in a minute. But a second point is, if you have figured out the variable ordering heuristic, which is basically most constrained first, and then what is the value ordering heuristic? Among the values, which value would you try first?
Most common.
And what?
Would it be the most common?
Least constraining value. So the idea is you pick the variable that is the hardest to satisfy because it has the fewest values. But having picked it, you still want to solve the problem. So you want to give it the value that is least constraining to everybody else. Okay, and those are the classical CSP heuristics. These are just the beginnings of it. There are many nice versions of it, but you should at least know the most constraining variable and least constraining value heuristics. Okay, those are actually very important, and if you do that itself, most CSP search algorithms go faster. A third idea actually is this idea called forward checking. And that bears a little more thinking. What forward checking does is, as soon as you give a value to a variable, it looks into the future. So for example, there is this terminology in CSPs that, when I am here, my current variable is y, because I'm considering giving values to y. My past variables are x. My future variables are z. Right? So at any point in search tree, during the search, in the search tree, you have there's a current variable, there's past variables, there are future variables. Okay, if your current variable's value is already inconsistent with the past variable values, that would be something that the constraints will tell you. Right? The reason you went back off this level is because the value I just gave to y wound up being inconsistent with a past variable value. A past variable value. So you should go back. But what would be useful is also to see if there is enough values left for the future variables. If the future variables are going to not have any values left after you take your valuation, then you're just blithely going forward, but you're going to die anyway, because everybody needs to get a value. Okay, and sometimes because of the values that you gave to current and past variables, the variables that are to come downstairs, they may not have enough values left, because for every value that they can possibly take, some constraint is violated. You can say, I'll just wait until the constraint is actually violated and then backtrack, okay? But you can actually notice this, you can do this, reasoning up front. Okay, and if you do that reasoning up front, that's called forward checking. And there, essentially, you keep track of the domains of each of the variables, pruning the values from the variable's domain if it's no longer possible in that branch. And now, of course, when you do this, when you get out of the branch, you better put those values back. You see what I'm saying? So forward checking involves a more interesting implementation, so you just have to make sure that, you temporarily remove certain values from the variables. Now, if you do that, then in essence, then the next variable to be picked is not the one that has the lowest domain size as the problem is given, but the one that has the lowest domain size left after doing the forward check. And that is basically called forward checking plus dynamic variable ordering, because the variables will now be ordered differently in different branches. Whereas the static variable ordering upfront itself decides, okay, I know all the variables, I know their domain sizes, so I'll just figure out one ordering and I'll stick to it in every branch. Dynamic variable ordering will have a different ordering in every branch. But none of them will ever backtrack on the variable orderings. Okay, so let me show you, let's go over those examples, So this is the heuristics for which value to choose and which variable to most constraint variable first, at least constraint value first. And let me see whether I will do this, or I'll show a slightly different example. I mean, there are multiple examples, but this is one. I have one more something to show. Yeah. So this example is a 4 queens problem, a different problem instead of coloring problem. Okay. And it's interesting that it's a 4x4 chessboard, so then the queens are x1, x2, x3, x4. The assumption is at least that each queen has to have its own column, right? So you assume x1 is in the column 1 queen, x2 is the column 2 queen, x3 is the column 3 queen, and so on. The question is, which row of its column does the queen go to, so that it won't conflict with any other queen, right? So, I'm assuming people know enough about chess to realize that if you put a queen here, then you can't put a queen here or here or here or here, because all diagonals it will conflict. Neither can you put it in this row anywhere. And neither can you put it in this column, but we already decided that there's only one queen per column, so it'll be fine. Okay, so my modeling for this problem is I will have one variable for each of the queens, x1 to x4, and the values are the row in that column that queen will be sitting in. Okay, so x1 can sit in 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so on. Okay, now once again, the constant, the static variable ordering will say everybody has the same size of the domains. So there's not much of a difference, right? But as you do forward checking, it becomes more interesting. And again, this is the constraint graph. Basically, this is showing that everybody can, so x1 can interact, everybody can interact with everybody. That's what it's saying in this case. It's a pretty bad graph, okay? It's a complete graph. Okay, that's as bad as it gets in constraint graphs. Okay, and then I'm keeping this is somebody else's slides actually, and they nicely did this animation, so that's why I'm using this. And keep this is in the beginning, this is the live domains for everybody, okay? And as we give values to any of the variables, the live domains for some of the variables will reduce. That's the idea. Now the interesting thing is, if anybody below you, that any of the future variables ever gets its live domain to be empty, then you can just backtrack. It does not matter when you would have picked that variable, you might as well backtrack. And in fact, DVR actually is a generalization of that idea. Because if anybody has empty domain, then that dynamic variable ordering, that is the smallest domain possible. Empty domain is the smallest domain possible. So a heuristic which says pick the variable with the smallest domain will pick the zero size domain first and will likely fail. But the heuristic is more general, such that if there is one with 0, one with 1, and the rest with 3 domains, then it will pick 0. If there's one with 1 and rest with 3 domains, then it will pick the variable with size 1. Okay. By the way, variable domain with size 0 means forced backtrack. Variable with size 1 means forced choice. Because that's the only choice. You made your bet. Based on the values you gave to the past variables, this variable has this value. You may as well just write it into your assignment. And anything larger than 1, you still have a choice. You need to do the search. Okay. So that's all I'm going to show here. Basically, if I put that twin there, then x1 equal to 1, and now when x1 equal to 1, then essentially x2 cannot be 1 or 2, x3 cannot be 1 or 3, x4 cannot be 1 or 4. Right? That's basically what it's saying. And then at this point, notice that at least, so again, unfortunately, all of them have the same size in this case. Okay, still same size thing. So let's say I picked x2 this time, and I put it at 3. So since I put x2 at 3, at this point, x3 has no domain left. So you backtrack. That's what forward checking helps you. Of all the ideas that I've shown, forward checking with dynamic variable ordering is an extremely good idea. Okay, you can solve very large size problems with just that heuristic. A very simple idea, but it's very good. Okay. Part of what we'll do the rest of the class is actually making forward checking be, something a particularly theoretically interesting idea by talking about something called consistency, level of consistency of a CSP. Okay. So anyway, so you can continue playing with this, and then at this point, since this won't work, then I have to actually go back and try a different value for x2. Okay, and then so that I tried 4, and when I try 4, at this point both of them still have values. Then I gave x3 a value 2, and when I give x3 a value 2, now x4 has no values again. Okay, so I go back, I have to continue in that particular case, and I have to go back and give a different value. Okay, until I have considered all the values for each of the variables. In which case, if they still don't find any solution, that means there is no solution. Okay, so that's basically the forward checking idea. One other idea that I want to mention is this. So I talked about variable ordering heuristic, value ordering heuristic, and forward checking. Of those, forward checking and variable ordering are very good ideas. Okay, but I want to also get another idea into your head, which is basically connected to this notion of intelligent backtracking, okay, which I mentioned earlier. So this is a slightly different problem where I wrote, this is just an abstract CSP problem where x, y, u, and v can take values from a, b, c, d, e. And w and I can only take, w can take only values from d and e, I can only take values from a and b. Okay, and then these are my constraints. If x equal to a, w cannot be equal to e. If y equal to b, w cannot be equal to d. If u equal to c, I cannot be equal to a. If b equal to d, I cannot be equal to b. Okay, now suppose I'm trying to solve this problem. Okay, and suppose I actually started with x equal to a here, and then I have my node which says x equal to a. Then I picked y and I gave it a value b. Then I have x equal to a, y equal to b. Then I picked v and I gave it a value, I have v equal to d. Then I picked u and I gave it a value, v equal to c. Then I picked w, I gave it a value e, because w can only take d and e. right? And then I come here. When I give W equal to E, then X equal to A and W equal to E is not allowed, right? So you fail here. Okay, and actually when you are about to go back, I would suggest you explain to yourself, why did I fail? That's what intelligent people do, right? You know, why did I fail here? There is a big assignment here. You could say, well, if I ever see this entire assignment, I know I'll fail again. But is that the real reason why you failed here? Tell me a reason as to why this assignment is failing. X equal to A, W equal to E. That's the reason. Sometimes there are multiple explanations as to why something failed. Right? For example, maybe there is one more assignment and one more constraint which said V equal to D and W equal to E is not allowed. So then there are actually two reasons why a node failed. That's an interesting issue. But at least neither, you can pick either of them as the explanations, but you should not have picked the entire node as the explanation. Makes no sense, right? You see what I'm saying? Okay, so I would say that the explanation for this node's failure is X equal to A and W equal to E. That's the explanation. Okay, just bear with me, remember this. Now, so anyway, you go back and you try W equal to D, because that's the only other value left. And you come here and you fail again. This time you fail because W equal to D and Y equal to B is not allowed. Right? Okay? So I fail again. Now remember that, so in this case what would be the explanation? Y equal to B and W equal to D. Okay? Right? So, you fail here. Now what would you do normally if you're doing backtracking? You go back one level up and give different values for you. If you're still awake, does it make sense to give different values to you? That's the problem with chronological backtracking. It does not analyze why we failed. Okay? The ship is sinking and we are rearranging, tables and things, because when the ship wasn't sinking, the tables were proper, so let's just put them in the right order, maybe ship will stop sinking. Right? I mean, explanation-based learning is just a great idea. I mean, in general, we do it all the time. Even when you don't have an explanation, we come up with explanations and then ensure that explanation doesn't hold. So, in fact, I would say that the reason people would say, well, things went badly to me today because it's after all Friday the 13th, is because they have a poor theory of how world works. And they applied that theory, and they found, well, the best explanation I have as to why I didn't do well in the exam today is not because I slept the whole day yesterday and then, drank the morning, but it's Friday the 13th. That's the explanation. And so then they'll say, I'll never take an exam on Friday the 13th. Okay, which makes no sense. But same thing we used to do for, we had explanations as to why various celestial phenomena will occur using our completely wrong, theories. The difference here is we do have a complete theory. And we are applying that complete theory to explain ourselves why something is failing. Now, the lazy people would ignore those explanations and still do chronological backtracking. The intelligent people will say, hey, look, is there any point in doing backtracking at you? No. Basically, what is my conflict set? What's my conflict set?
X, A, Y, B.
Conflict set is X and Y. Right? Because as I go out of W, basically the only variables that are mentioned anywhere in the failure are X and Y. So you should backtrack all the way to one of them. Otherwise you're not going to avoid this failure. And you may say, well, there may have been another failure, but it doesn't matter. All that matters is one bullet is enough, right? One failure explanation is enough. And as long as that failure explanation holds, this is never going to succeed anyway. Just a second. Okay? And so the point is that I have basically reasoned to myself that the conflict set here is, the conflict explanation here, by the time I get out of W, my conflict explanation is x equal to A and y equal to B. Okay, and when I regress, so in fact you can think of this in terms of regressing explanations over decisions. Okay, so you are regressing this explanation x equal to A, W equal to E over the decision W is given E. What must be true before this such that after this decision this will be true? X equal to A must be true here. So if you regress this here, on this side x equal to A. Okay? And from this side y equal to B. If both hold, then you're going to die below this. So x equal to A and y equal to B is the explanation as to why this node is dying. What's interesting is this node is dying, but it didn't know it. Right? It just tried stuff. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay? Now having done this, at this point I'll say, should I try considering a different value for u? And that depends on, if I take x equal to A, y equal to B and regress it over u equal to C, does the explanation change? If it doesn't change, that means you are just a passerby, you're just a bystander. There is no point in redoing u. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay, so I go over this, it will still be x equal to A, y equal to B. I go over this, it will still be x equal to A, y equal to B. I go over this, it says x equal to A. So that means I should try a different value. You see what I'm saying? It's just a very systematic idea. You have an intuition for it. I'm just telling you that it's actually possible to do this intelligent backtracking by just keeping track of why failures occur. Yes, sir.
So if we were applying forward checking to this, wouldn't branches...
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. Many of these ideas, are competing. So, in fact, his point is that if you were doing forward checking, this particular failure may not have actually happened. That is true. But there are other kinds of failures that forward checking may not have caught. In particular, forward checking catches, we'll see in a minute that forward checking is a partial consistency enforcement idea. It's a particular kind of failures it does catch, but many others it doesn't. And this this idea, when you reach all the way down and somebody's constraint is violated, you have to admit the constraint is violated. Okay, these sometimes are actually sort of, so anyway, forward checking and consistency enforcement essentially stop the failures from happening in the first place, but not all failures, because stopping every failure from occurring is as hard as solving the CSP problem. We'll see this in a minute again. It will be like this heuristic versus search. You can spend a lot more time on the heuristic and a lot less time on the search, but you can be looking for perfect heuristic, which takes more time than the search itself. Okay. Now, in this case, so you see this, right? So you can see the intelligent backtracking part of it. Now, here is my other point. Well, I did get this nice little thing called x equal to A, y equal to B. That's now a constraint. It's not written here, but it's a constraint. In somewhere else, in some other branch, I might wind up again having some partial assignment which has x equal to A, y equal to B, and I shouldn't have to redo this whole thing. I should remember that constraint. This is an induced constraint. This is entailed by the existing constraints. Do you understand what I'm saying? So in a logical notation, this whole setup entails this. Now you could say, why didn't you just compute the entailment before itself? And again say, if you do that, you would do more work than is needed. What we are doing here is, if I do encounter a failure, remember the reason. You could actually say, why doesn't, why don't we design planes that will never ever fall down from sky? We try, but eventually, if Boeing keeps saying, we still haven't completely proved to ourselves that the planes will never ever fall down from the sky, then Boeing will not get any money, and then this European Space Agency, European thing, Airbus will get all the money. So Boeing will cut corners and will say, hey, no, it looks like for 3 years they should stay up. Let's just go ahead and put the planes out, and then when they fall, at least make sure that you understand why they fell. So that at least you should fall for the same exact reason. And by the way, you take this for granted, and one of the things I say is it's a cultural issue. In many Western civilizations, especially in US, I may have said bad things about US before, but one great thing about US culture is explaining a failure. You must explain. The amount of money that went into explaining why Challenger went down, okay, is humongous. And I'm originally from India, and we in India would say, what's the chance that Challenger would go down exactly for the same reason again? So let's just move on. You see what I'm saying? So culturally, for me, it's a humongously good point that you pour all the money to explain, because all you can do in life is not make the same error again. That's all. There will be new errors that you will make again, right? But at least avoid making the same exact error. And it's not easy, because actually analyzing that can be costly in itself. And there's only so much money, and apparently there are all these budget cuts, and so, what are you going to do? Forget about it, so hopefully it won't happen again. Okay? But in general, what I'm trying to say is, in the case of Boeing, it did, explain after something falls down. In the case of Challenger, we explained why it happened, and at least we made sure that the O-ring-based fall failure won't occur. Did that take care of everything? No. Then there was this brick-oriented failure where the heat shielding brick falls off, and then the I think the other one, Columbia, I guess, went in, it burned to death basically because of that one. So you cannot upfront, upfront stopping all the failures is basically forward checking on steroids, okay, or entailment on steroids. But that would basically never end. Okay, so you go forward, but you do, when you see the failure, using analysis of the failure to avoid that failure in the future is a very useful thing, both in life and, this is a much simpler thing than life, because here you have complete theory, and, if you do and use the explanations, you can do better. Okay, so that's a great idea, in my opinion. Okay, and just think of how much you're saving. For example, notice that the Y could have been like 15 levels above this, depending on your search, depending on your variable ordering. Okay, and stopping that is very useful, because instead of doing this chronological backtracking here, you went all the way there. Okay. Furthermore, not only can Y be 15 levels above, it actually could be that U has 1 million possible values. And you will try each of them to see if you can avoid the failure. That's completely stupid, because that's not the reason. Right? And there's so many real world examples where people will go and work on something which has no connection to the original reason for failure to begin with. And if you ever see that yourself doing it, tell yourself that makes no sense. Is it part of your explanation for failure? Okay? If it's not, then you shouldn't be working on it. And using that in CSP is a good idea. Now, made a huge deal about it. The question is it worth it, really? And all I can say is there are many of these ideas in CSP and SAT solvers, and I mentioned that SAT solvers can solve very large problems. So for example, I was just looking earlier before coming to the class, somebody's SAT problem, which file starts with CNF, 56,785, and 386,979. And normally the SAT community writes its SAT problems this way. Start the file header with the number of variables number of classes. And they write the classes in 3-SAT form because every satisfiability problem can be written as a 3-SAT problem with only a polynomial increase in size. And so, and the classes would be like this: -1, 75, -34. That means the first variable is appearing with negative polarity. So there is like a symbol table which says 1 is A, 75 is B, and 34th variable is W, let's say. So this is really nothing but not A, R, D, R, not W. That's what it is. So they write it this way. Okay? And so, and if you write it in pages and pages, there'll be like 46,000 pages before the number of classes will end. Right? Because remember, the number of classes is 386,979. And as of almost maybe 8 years back, problems of that size could be solved in under minutes. It'll take longer than that to read the damn problem. But if you, the moment it's in, it's solved, essentially. And the ideas they use are basically variable ordering, value ordering, forward checking, and in particular, this idea of dynamic backtracking and clause learning. So in the case of in this problem, we just noticed that we would now want to remember x equal to a implies y not equal to b. You want to remember that. That's a learned constraint, or you can call it a learned clause. If it was SAT, it would just be a clause, learned clause. And one of the ideas that's been particularly effective in the systematic SAT solvers actually is clause learning. So understanding clause learning that I just showed you here is actually quite useful. There's a lot more, in an industrial strength SAT solver to make sure that you can do this very fast. They have very nice data structures. Okay, it's worth reading. But one of the great ideas that's behind the efficiency is clause learning. Okay. Now, having said that, it's not obvious that clause learning will work all the time. Because the problem with clause learning is that there may be too many clauses to be learned. Okay? Because there are many induced clauses. Given the few real clauses, real constraints, there are many induced constraints. And if you hang around with those constraints, the problem is every search node is going to check every one of these clauses to see if it is consistent with them. Even if the answer is 99.9999999% of the time is yes, you are consistent, you still wasted time asking. That's what adds to the search. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay? So, in fact, you should be careful about clause learning. You not only need to remember, but you also need to forget. Clause learning is sort of like, it has some analogies to paging strategies. Right? Okay? So the question is, basically you're trying to avoid relearning something that you already learned. A failure that you already explained. But if you wrote down all failures that ever happened in your life, then you would keep checking, is today a possible candidate for a failure that I have experienced in, 1997 on, September 14th. And then you will read the whole explanation for that day's failure and then compare it to today's state and see whether or not it's working. Most of the time the answer is no, it's not relevant. But you wasted time still. Do you see what I'm saying? So clause learning has been actually around for the longest time. It used to be called no-good learning. And just like nonsense planning, it too is both a put down and a descriptive name. Okay, it's no good learning in the sense x equal to a, y equal to b is a no good. No good assignment will have them as part of the full assignment. Okay, but you can also say that, and then so this idea has been invented long back in like 70s. But then people also realized there are exponentially many no goods. And if you keep checking each of those no goods, you will waste a lot of time. This is a problem with any learning essentially, but this is something that is particularly true for this kind of deductive learning because it's very easy to learn these classes. Okay, and after a while you will be checking whether or not any of those classes are consistent with your current assignment, and you waste a lot of time. And that's the utility problem. And so for the longest time people stopped using no good learning, almost acting as if it is no good as a learning technique. Okay, but as I said, now actually they use them. And part of what they do is essentially to start forgetting classes when they come out of certain branches. So they have a way not only of adding classes but forgetting classes. So they'll keep a memory for the classes, the learned classes. That's fixed to begin with. And you can only put a new class in if you remove an old class out, somebody out. Who do you remove it? You can remove the oldest class, for example. You can also remove class that no longer is relevant to this branch. Because in this branch, suppose I have a class, so for example, suppose eventually, I started going in this direction, then in essence, any classes I might have learned about V equal to D and U equal to C are not worth remembering. Because in this branch, those values are not. And especially if I come here and Y is no longer P, any class with respect to Y equal to B does not have to be remembered. You realize that, of course, when you go up above this, you may have to reinvent it. But that's the price you pay for not having to be particularly paranoid and checking every assignment with every class. It looks almost ad hoc. You're saying there are all these entailed classes, but I only remember 15 of them. That's reasonable, it turns out. I mean, in some sense, people from OS, operating systems will think of, if every page is in the main memory, then the main memory is the disk, essentially. And somebody has to then be, handling these pages. Okay, that's the kind of, that's the reason why originally this idea was not catching on, but more recently people have come up with good techniques for, getting rid of classes. And also quickly checking whether the classes are satisfying, are matching the current assignment, and that improves the search very well. Yes, sir. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, follow your point. Even for the given constraint, we can also ignore some given constraint and we get some rank, right?
Meaning what?
Meaning some given constraint is not relevant.
You can, but the assumption is that these will never change in size. I mean, his point, but these will never change in size. The clauses are the derived theorems. Okay, all of these essentially will be, so you can forget, matching them, but that doesn't save anywhere near as much as the derived classes because they are humongously large compared, the number of them is much, much larger than this. That's the issue. Okay. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So one other point I should mention is all these ideas are actually called systematic search strategies. Okay. In a systematic search strategy, if you don't find an answer, you exhausted the tree, then it's a proof that there is no answer to the problem. Okay, which also basically means one of the problems with systematic search is it does not look at the local gradients in the search space. It must deal with this tree. The tree essentially says, if you want to change the value of x, you're right here, okay? At this point, you can see that if I just change the value of x, I'm done. Because x equal to b, I know it's a solution. I mean, for whatever reason, I could see it's a solution. I just want to change the value of x. But in a systematic search, you're not allowed to do that. You have to go all the way up here and change it. And if you don't do intelligent backtracking, you will have to spend a lot of time before you get a chance to change the value of x. And a deep point about systematic search, this is a deep point, that you are putting bookkeeping constraints on your search. so that you would never go back to the same part of the search space again and again and again. Okay, a definition of systematic search is never leave any stone unturned and never unturn any stone indefinite number of times. Do you see what I'm saying? I have to say indefinite number instead of saying more than once, because iterative deepening approaches do turn a stone more than once. Okay? Systematic search basically says don't go back to the node infinitely often, and do go to every node. The way you ensure that you have done that is this bookkeeping constraints. The search tree does that for you. But that also becomes an albatross when you can see the solution and you want to jump, but it's in the next ship. And there is no way, you have to go all the way back to the port and change the ships to be on that ship. That's the systematic search problem. Local search, on the other hand, has no commitments. It's happy to jump anytime. But then it also means it has no clue where it's been before, and so it can keep going in local cycles. Okay? And then of course, but it's worth talking about what would a local search for CSP look like. You essentially search only in the space of complete assignments. So you guess a complete assignment. Okay? And then see if it's already a solution. If you're really lucky, you're done. It will be a solution because none of the constraints are violated. If not, then pick a constraint that is violated and change the value of one of the variables, relevant variables, such that the constraint is no longer violated. Now it's your new assignment. See, loop again, basically see if you're done. If not, again, pick a constraint that's violated and then change the value. Okay, this is a hill climbing strategy. This is essentially one of the things you can do is when you are changing the value of a variable, that is violating a constraint. There may be multiple possible ways you can change that variable's value. You might want to do some reasoning. You might say, well, X is not going to work with A. I have to try either B or C. With X equal to B, here is my complete assignment. X equal to C, here is my complete assignment. With X equal to B, I am violating 15 constraints still. X equal to C, I'm only violating 7 constraints. So I'll be greedy. I'm hill climbing. So I'll just pick X equal to C and say that's my next search node. If you do that, then you do local search. And then hopefully, you will just reach, all the constraints are satisfied. If you ever just bump into a complete assignment which satisfies all constraints, you're done. Okay. Now, of course, local search has all sorts of problems in the sense, for example, that you can get into local minima. You may be stuck with an assignment which, in essence, has the form that current assignment only violates 3 constraints, maybe even 1 constraint, as this guy says, 1 constraint. And that 1 constraint involves X and Y. Now, if you decide to change the value of X, the best you can do is 15 constraints violated. So hill climbing will say, I've gotten as far as I can. I'm going to stay here because I'm in a local minimum. Okay? So that's the usual problem with hill climbing strategies. And there are ways in which you can avoid that, which is essentially do random restart. For example, after starting, you start with an assignment, keep making iterative changes to it for about, let's say, 1,500 changes of variables. And if you still haven't gotten a solution, rather than continue in the same path, just randomly reset yourself to a completely different part of the search tree. Just random, pick a completely new random assignment and start all over again. If you do that, it already, asymptotically guaranteed to find a solution. And there are better approaches. One of which is, in the beginning, essentially just be greedy and pick the variable and value that will minimize the number of constraints. So there's this notion of, so I said basically you always pick the assignment that has the lowest number of constraints violated. But if you have a small probability P, such that with probability P, you pick a random assignment. Okay, and it's probability P. So you have a current assignment and it's violating some constraint involving x and y. You decided to work on value of x equal to a, value of x equal to b, and this is violating 17 constraints, this is violating 3 constraints. Normally, greedy hill climbing will pick this. All I am saying is, let's have an extra parameter p, which is the probability with which you will just pick randomly among these. Okay? With probability p, you would pick randomly, and probability 1 minus p, you will actually pick the greedy one. If you do that once again, you will be asymptotically optimal. And there are also ideas like simulated annealing which are connected. Okay, local search strategies for CSP are actually quite fast. One of the interesting things is first interest in solving large-scale SAT problems happened when somebody found out that this very simple idea, bin conflicts heuristic, that is heuristic which says, pick the variable, and in the case of SAT, all this discussion becomes even simpler. Because in the case of SAT, once you find a constraint that's violated, you just have to pick one of the variables in that constraint and flip it. Because it only has two values. So changing a value will flip the variable. Okay? Now the question is, which variable are you going to flip? And that was being decided by, whichever variables flip will reduce the violated constraint to the maximum. And then if you do these kinds of ideas with some probability, you do, any one of them. And with 1 minus p probability, you will only pick the greedy one. That is the one with the lowest number of constraints. That simple idea wound up solving very large sized SAT problems compared to the ones before. Compared to the systematic SAT problems, SAT algorithms before. So for a while, back in early 90s, 92 to 96 or so, people assumed that large-scale SAT and CSP problems will be solved using local search techniques. And all the intro to AI people had to quickly start teaching local search techniques in combinatorial search problems. Now, that's interesting because local search is the only search you can do in continuous spaces. There is no such thing as systematic search in continuous spaces because you can have infinite number of values that you have to consider. Okay, and gradient descent is basically a local search technique. Okay, but in combinatorial search, you essentially would like to draw the tree and then make sure that you're doing things systematically. That's what we're doing, right? For a while, it looked as if local search will win the day until I think, suddenly people started finding that you can actually write very fast systematic search algorithms, which is actually a good thing because local search algorithms can never prove that there is no solution. And sometimes proving that there is no solution is what you want to do. That's a good thing. So for example, proving that the plane will never fall off the sky is what you want to do. Proving that the circuit will not get into a bad state is what you want to do in circuit verification. Local search essentially will say, I tried for a while, I didn't find a solution. That doesn't necessarily mean there is no solution. If a systematic search says there is no solution, that's a proof that there is no solution. So if you won using systematic search, you get extra points. And so it's actually nice that systematic search is currently the state of the art in terms of the speed. It's not that you should completely forget local search, but systematic search actually does quite well. And it uses all those ideas. The problem with local search is you almost don't need any theory for it. You just flip, right? And you just basically, the interesting theory is all in terms of asymptotic convergence proofs, that's it. Okay, but whereas for systematic search, I can talk about forward checking and I can draw animations, I can talk about class learning, I can draw animations and all these things. Okay, one of the interesting things, of course, is, as I said, local search does as well as it does because it does not have too much commitments. No commitments whatsoever. It's ready to pack up and move anywhere. It has no commitments to the search tree. Search tree, on the other hand, is bound by search tree. And there are a whole bunch of ideas for systematic search that use this insight and try to make systematic search not be more committed than it needs to be. Not be more committed than it needs to be to prove exhaustion of search space, and that you are not going to look at as anything more than once. Okay, a particularly good idea, which unfortunately doesn't work well in practice, but beautiful theory, is an idea called dynamic backtracking. Dynamic backtracking is a systematic search strategy for CSPs without search trees. Beautiful idea. If you read it and if you want to talk about it, come to my office and I'll talk to you about it. But unfortunately, there is no good implementation of it. It's one of those, great ideas that I mentioned. I used to also spend time explaining it, but now I won't because, it doesn't work in practice. But it helps you understand that it is possible to come up with algorithms that have best of both worlds. Best of no commitment oriented, least commitment, local search strategy, and commitment oriented search tree strategy, which does give you certain advantages. Okay? There was somebody, yes?
Yeah, it's just here. Can you go back to the previous slide? Yeah. If we have the local search in the system search, like for example, when
systematic, okay.
Yeah, systematic search. For example, we are in the node 5, and we know that it's only two clouds breaks a constraint, and we induce a local search from that node. If we can get the result very quickly, and we get the result. If cannot, go back to the node file.
Those are all sorts of ideas that people have tried. It's not a bad idea. There are a million ideas people have tried that combine, different